So just a disclaimer, this webinar today is not a food safety training, and a lot of people are hoping that they can get a food safety training in an hour and a half, but that is not how it works, unfortunately. What we're hoping to do is just help you understand the difference between GAP certification, which a buyer might require, and the produce safety rule, which is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. There are many acronyms that you may or may not want to learn, but some of them we're going to teach you today. Oops, hang on a second. I always forget I've got to do that. All right, so I'm going to start with GAP certification versus FSMA regulation. So GAP certification is something that's been around since the 90s. It really started in Europe with large retail grocery stores, big international chains wanting to have some assurance that the buyers that they were getting produce from all around the world were paying attention to and understood food safety. They were getting a little bit scared with all the food safety scares and contamination, produce contamination problems that were happening. And so this spread over into the States, and now we have a number of quite a few different organizations, government and non-government, for-profit and non-profit, that provide food safety auditing and food safety certification. And then GAP certification, if you need to do this, you would pay a third-party auditor to assess your farming operation. So they would come to your farm, they'd look at your food safety plan, they'd look at your records, they'd look at your different procedures, and they are usually comparing these to a set of produce safety standards. And I'm going to go into this into a little bit more detail later on. This is just a quick overview. Then if you pass your audit, you're issued with a food safety certificate or a GAP certificate. And then every year to preserve your certification, you need to have this audit. And this is something that may be required by your buyer. It is not required by law. It is not a regulation. It's voluntary. It's a business decision. If you want to sell to a buyer who requires GAP certification, then you need to get GAP certification. And then the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA as we call it, is something that came about in large part because of consumers being very concerned about their loved ones getting sick and in some cases dying. It's not a fun thing to get an E. coli or Listeria or Salmonella or any of the other bacteria or viruses that can affect you. It can be very scary, particularly people with vulnerable health. So this particular group, Stop Foodborne Illness, now is a very loud voice in DC, urging legislators to come up with stronger controls for the food industry, basically. And there are several regulations under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The one that affects produce farmers is the Produce Safety Rule, and Stuart's going to go into more information about that soon. So it is new FDA regulations. They were brought into law in 2011. The Produce Safety Rule was rolled out in 2016, and this is the second year that farms of a certain size have had to comply with it. There are free on-farm readiness reviews, probably Stuart will talk about those, free inspections, and a one-time grower training and once you've participated in that, you get a certificate of attendance. Right now, there are no costs involved with the inspection. There's a small cost involved with the training, whereas with GAP certification, you do have to pay for the audit. There are some cost-sharing programs out there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. So the thing about FSMA and the Produce Safety Rule is it is the law. And if you're covered, this is the term that they use, meaning that if you have to comply with this law, it's the law. It doesn't matter what your buyers require. It's something you have to do to be legal. Now, if your buyer requires you to be GAP certified, but you are not required to comply with the law, and you want to sell to that buyer, then you need to have GAP certification, regardless of whether you're required by law to comply with the Produce Safety Rule. And both of these are based on good agricultural practices. The GAP certification gets into more detail. Produce safety rule is concerned primarily with biological contaminants, but GAPs cover biological, physical, and chemical contamination of fruits and vegetables. And these are all the ways that contaminants can be introduced. Some of the many ways, I should say, that contaminants can be introduced into produce. So I'm going to stop there. I did create this table comparing GAP certification and the produce safety rule, but I'm not going to go into this now. We'll look at it again at the end. Once you've heard everything Stuart has to say about the produce safety rule and everything I have to say about GAP certification. So Stuart, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. All right, let me... All right, is everyone tracking with me?
Yep.
All right, so yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So I'm going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act, and we'll probably from here on out just call it FSMA. That's what, when maybe you've heard this and you don't know what people are referring to prior to this webinar, the Food Safety Modernization Act. So we're going to start with just the basics of that. And Lindsay kind of mentioned this. It's a really sweeping reform to food safety. It's, you know, in about 70 years there hasn't been this kind of reform to it, and it really aims to move from you know, responding to contamination to preventing it. So what can we do on the front end rather than just reacting to things? There are 7 rules within the Food Safety Modernization Act. And you can see those there. The ones we're going to speak to today is the produce safety rule. Okay, so the produce safety rule, yeah, there's, you know, a lot that can be spoken about it, but essentially, it's a requirement for if you are covered by this rule, regardless of, you know, if a buyer is asking you to have it, just like Lindsay has explained already. And this can get a little confusing, and so I'm going to try and make it not confusing. That's why we're here today. Yeah, the FDA sort of estimated that there are about 35,500 farms covered in the U.S. In Virginia, particularly, that looks like about 500. And so we're going to sort of look at what that looks like for you. And so it really establishes minimum standards that are based on science. Their FDA are doing a incredibly good job of continuing to improve how it's based on science as they go along. And it's for, you know, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce. So all of those different things. And so the main areas that it focuses on are really worker training. Health and hygiene is a huge one. Agricultural, water, soil amendments, you know, animals in the farm, and then equipments, tools, and the buildings that come into contact with them. And so it's looking at a risk-based approach, so looking at high-risk practices and not necessarily the commodities themselves. And this rule, you know, I will say, you know, having to comply with rules might not be fun, but the FDA is really doing it in an educational approach, and it's not constrictive, as in you have to use this method in this way, and that's the only way you can figure this out. It does allow for different practices, and you know, it helps you sort of make this applicable on your farm. So we're going to jump into the world of exemptions from this regulation. I'm going to try and explain this the most concise way that I can. There's a lot to this, but I think it should be pretty easy to understand, hopefully. So who's affected by the produce safety rule? You might be thinking, you know, do I even need to worry about this? Am I covered? So essentially, if you are an operation that grows, harvests, packs, or holds produce, you might be covered by the rule, you might be exempt, or you might be qualified exempt. There are 3 different categories you can fall into. And there are a number of ways you can figure this out. The FDA, Lindsay had a flowchart on her screens. The FDA has come up with a coverage and exemption flowchart down the bottom on this slide, and we're going to send all these to you so that you have this information. But down the bottom of this slide, I actually created a survey, an interactive survey that can help you through this process. And I am going to try and share my screen so that can everyone see that? The web page?
Yes.
Great. So this is what that link will take you to. It's in Spanish. It's also in English, and it's an online survey that allows you to sort of go through this. I'm not going to go through every step of it because I'm going to explain that in my slides. But essentially, it allows you to answer questions one at a time, and then it allows you to get pushed through to the next question, rather than trying to figure it all out at once.
Oh, sorry, Stuart. Actually, it's not showing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, never mind. That's okay. You'll have to just click through and have a look at that. But essentially, this survey that I created, lets you go through one question at a time, and based on what you answer, it sends you to a different question, and then it'll tell you exactly where you fall within the rule. So there are a number of different ways. We're going to do a little bit of a different method. And so if we're going to look at if someone is exempt from the produce safety rule, and the first thing you have to consider is if you sell less than $25,000 of produce averaged over 3 years, over the previous 3 years. Now that $25,000 is adjusted for inflation, and so the current figure is $26,999. So essentially, if you sell less than that on average over the last 3 years in produce, then the FDA kind of sees you as too small, and you're exempt from the rule. Okay. The other thing you can consider is that if you only grow a commodity that the FDA considers rarely consumed raw, then if that's all you grow and there's going to be a kill step, which would be someone at home cooking it, then you're also exempt from the rule. If you grow something that's destined for processing, so for example, as you grow tomatoes that are all going for tomato sauce that's going to get processed and it's going to have a kill step, you can also be exempt. And also if you grow produce that's grown just for personal consumption. This one is always kind of interesting to me, because if you are growing more than $25,000 worth of produce and you're eating that all yourself, you either have an incredibly large family or you're a very hungry person. Either way, you'd be exempt. This is an exhaustive list of the exempt commodities. And so the FDA came up with this list of things that are rarely consumed raw. And I want to point out here that this is not if you grow one of these, then your entire operation is exempt. This is if you only grow potatoes, for example. Then you wouldn't be worried about this rule, because potatoes, people don't generally pick a potato off the shelf and just bite into it. They usually cook it. And so if you grew spinach and potatoes, then the spinach would obviously be covered. All right, so this might throw you into okay, if you fall under one of those things, then you might be completely exempt. Now there's the second category, which is qualified exempt. Okay, and this is based on a monetary value as well. And so this is assuming you sell more than $25,000 in produce sales, but it pushes you into this next question. And so that's during the previous 3 years. So on average, the monetary value of all food sales. Okay, so food sales is not just produce sales. It's anything that can be consumed by a human. So we're talking all the way down to chewing gum, to beverages, anything that can be consumed as food by a human. Then the average annual monetary value of food for the farm, if you sold more than half of that directly to a qualified end user, and so that means that's the actual person who's going to be consuming it. And so there are some examples under there. So it's the consumer of the food. So if that's at a farmer's market or a CSA stand, or if it's at a restaurant or retail food establishment that's in the same state or no more than 275 miles. Yeah, I know that's a lot of information, but just try and track with me that essentially if you're selling it more than 50% of your food to that qualified end user, and the average of your food sales is under $500,000, then you'd be qualified exempt from this rule. Okay, so we're going to do a little quiz here to try and see if this all makes sense to you. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to type in the chat box or anything, but just try to answer this in your head. So a farm sells $19,000 in produce on average over a 3-year period at a local farmer's market and through a CSA. Okay, would they be covered by the produce safety rule? Okay, the answer is going to be no, because they sell less than $25,000 in produce. So they're too small. The FDA is not concerned with them, so they wouldn't be covered by this rule. Okay, what about this? You've got a farm that sells $35,600 in produce and also sells $650,000 in other food products, including sauerkraut and jam. Do they satisfy the qualified exempt? So they're over that 25,000 and they're over that 500,000. So the answer is no, because they're over that 25,000, and they can't be qualified exempt either because they're into the bigger category of selling to a lot of people. All right, and the last one we're going to look at here. So as a farm sells $475,000 in produce, okay, 200,000 of it goes to a wholesaler, 200,000 of it goes to a restaurant, 75,000 goes to a grocery store. Would they be qualified exempt? So they're obviously over that $25,000 in produce, right? But they're under the $500,000, and as you can see, most of their sales goes to the qualified end user. So the answer is yes, they would be qualified exempt, even though that's a lot of produce. Okay, and so if they are qualified exempt, then what they're required to do, they don't have to comply with the entire rule. They just have to display the name and complete business address of the farm where the produce was grown. That might be on the packaging label or on a poster, on a sign. And the compliance for that is January 1st of next year. Okay, and so it might look something like this. So they might be at their farmer's market or their CSA stand, and they'll have a sign up saying, hey, all this produce is grown here at whatever your farm name is, and here's my address. Okay. The other thing that they would need to do is you need to be able to prove that you're qualified exempt, and that's going to be through financial records. You might have a log sheet that says, here is all of our sales in produce, here's all of our sales in food, and you can prove to VDAX if they come and ask that you are qualified exempt. And you have to begin keeping those records as of January 26, 2016. So as of 3 years ago. Now, if you haven't started keeping those records, don't fret, just start keeping them now. And then you'll be able to continue being qualified exempt. Okay. So if you have questions, please go ahead and write them down for yourself, write them in the chat box. We're going to get to all of those at the end. There likely will be questions with all of this. Okay, I'm going to move on to if you're covered by the regulation. What does this mean? What are the things that you have to do? And when do you have to do them by? Okay, because again, this is not voluntary. This is not a gap thing that you've decided would be a good practice for your business. This is the law. And I will make a quick point. The FDA has the federal authority for this rule. In different states, most departments of agriculture are going to assume that authority. So in Virginia, the the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services has assumed the responsibility of doing these audits and going and doing the inspection, on the farms, which is nice. So you have a state person coming rather than a federal person. All right. So the first thing that I mentioned that it looks at is this worker health, hygiene, and training. And this is so crucially important. Lindsay mentioned before that part of this is you participating, you as I say you, the responsible person on the farm, participating in a Produce Safety Alliance grower training. This is a regulation of the rule, if you were covered by it, that someone on the operation needs to have gone through one of these trainings. This is not an annual training, it's a one and done kind of training, but the certificate does follow the person whose name is on the certificate. So if you decide that you want, I don't know, your harvest manager to go and do this training, and in a couple of years they decide to leave for another operation, then they take that with them, and you would have to then send someone else. So what we recommend is that the owner of the farming operation would go to one of these trainings so that they have it and it stays with them. We have in Virginia, we have a number of these trainings happening all the time. We currently have a lot of grant money to make these trainings very affordable. Usually they're only about $25 or $30 per person, and that's just, it's a full 8-hour training. And it's pretty much just covering the expense of food. Once the funding goes away for a number of states to offer these trainings, the price of these trainings will go up quite significantly. So, if you're hearing this and you haven't done one of these PSA grower trainings, then I strongly encourage you to find out where the closest training is where you are and attend one before the price goes up. And if you're not sure how to do that, that's why we are all here to help you with that. So you can contact us and figure out where your nearest training is. All right, so with worker health and hygiene training, you will be, if you're covered by the rule, you'll be required to conduct a yearly training for all of your workers. And this has to be documented, and you have to show what you trained your workers on and who was present and that kind of thing. You also have to be able to understand that if workers come in sick, then you need to know what to do with those workers. You need to train them to be able to tell you if they are sick and to not work with produce so that they could contaminate it. If they do, you need to figure out what you need to do with that. You need to have policies on personal cleanliness. You need to be able to train your employees how to avoid animal contact. You need to train your employees how to correctly wash their hands. You need to have a visitor policy. Okay, and so that is when your visitors come to your farm. Maybe you have a CSA, maybe you have agritourism. If your visitors come to your farm operation, do they know where the bathrooms are? Do they know where they can wash their hands? These sort of things. Do they, know not to throw a dirty diaper down in the lettuce field? Things like that. So they're similar to good agricultural practices, to GAP programs. Okay, the next thing is agricultural water. Now I'll put a caveat on this. The FDA is doing a risk assessment with this. They're doing further research, and they haven't nailed down exactly what agricultural water is going to look like. They will be requiring you to test your water. They just haven't figured out how many times they're asking people to do that. Okay, so take everything I say with agricultural water with a grain of salt, because they're still figuring this out. And in inspections currently, they won't be looking at agricultural water because they're still figuring that out. But essentially, ag water is anything that is intended to or likely to contact the harvestable portion of covered produce, and so or food contact surfaces. So if you're using, let's say you're using drip irrigation on steak tomatoes, Okay, that water is not intended or likely to touch the tomatoes because the tomatoes are staked up and the water is getting dripped right into the soil. So that wouldn't be considered ag water. If you were overhead spraying water onto lettuce, then yeah, that would be ag water, for example. Okay, if we're looking at production water, there are a whole number of different things. I'm going to skip over this because it can be a little confusing and they're still figuring out what exactly this will look like. Okay, what I'll let you know is if you are currently testing your water, keep doing that. Keep doing whatever program you're doing. If you're not testing your water at all, I would start testing your water just to have a good idea of maybe what's in your water. Okay. And yeah, when you're doing this, you want to inspect your water systems, and they're going to get you to establish a water quality profile. But again, they're still figuring out what this looks like. So I'll take that. The next thing they'll be looking at with this is biological soil amendments of animal origin. So if you are using biological soil amendments, so essentially they're asking if you're using compost, okay, then they're looking to see the way in which you're doing that. Okay, so is it contacting covered produce? Does it contact produce contact surfaces? Could it potentially contaminate ag water? Things like that. If you have a pile of compost over here and it is open to the environment and it sits there for an entire year, it's pretty likely that a bird or some wildlife is going to be able to get into that and then contaminate it. Okay, so how are you storing that biological soil amendment? Another thing I'll say about this is that the FDA is doing another risk assessment on the biological soil amendment. They're currently suggesting the National Organic Program standards, which says that there should be a 90 or 120 day waiting period from when you apply the raw manure to your fields to when you actually harvest. Okay, but again, they're doing a risk assessment on that recommendation because they need to figure out if the science is true about that. Okay, if you have created or if you've bought compost, right? So that's been completely treated through a scientific method, and it's gone through a validated process. Then there is no interval for when you should be when you can harvest. So if you have compost and it's completely safe, you're allowed to use that in any manner you see fit, and there's no interval that you should wait. If you're using completely raw manure, they're recommending a 90 or 120 day waiting period. But again, there's a risk assessment going on with that. So take that with a grain of salt. And then we move into domesticated and wild animals. Okay, so if you have working animals on your property, then you need to have an adequate waiting period for once you've allowed animals to graze. And then essentially what we're looking at here is if you have a working animal, you have a working dog or something like that, are you intentionally encouraging that animal to be in your lettuce fields or in your tomato fields, in your produce fields? If you're doing that, then the recommendation is going to be you need to stop doing that. You're never going to be able to completely exclude domestic animals, but what are your process? What's your steps for trying to do that? Okay, if you're encouraging your dog to sit on the harvest buckets once they've been full of produce, then that's not a good practice. You're never going to be able to stop wild animals. We all know that, and the produce safety rule doesn't try to enforce that you should. All it's saying is that and your staff knows, your workers know what to do when this happens. Okay, so you can see down here in this in the bottom right hand picture, there is a flag here, and so essentially someone has gone along this lettuce bed and has noticed animal intrusion has occurred. And maybe because there's some poop there on the lettuce, or maybe it's very noticeable that an animal's been eating away at that. And their staff knows, okay, well, if this lettuce has poop all over it, we're not going to harvest that. and we're not going to harvest some of the lettuce around it. Okay, it's up to you to train your staff to know what to do. Okay, it's not going to tell you that, well, you have deer, so you need to put up deer fencing. No, that's not what it's going to tell you. It's just going to tell you that you need to know what to do if deer poop in your field. All right, and then equipment and tools is the last, second to last thing we'll speak about, and that focuses really on the equipment that's likely to contact the covered produce. So maybe you have some knives that you use to go out and harvest produce with. Okay, are those being cleaned as they should be? And if they are, then you should have standard operating procedures. That's what SOPs stand for. You should have those in place to be able to train your employees. So if you just handed someone a piece of equipment and said, okay, please go clean that, you did that for 100 people, you'd probably get 100 different results. So you need to be able to explain and train your staff on how to clean. This goes for harvest buckets. It goes for all equipment and tools that are likely to contact that covered produce. And then buildings as well. So they're looking at the design of these buildings. If you have birds, nesting up in the rafters, pooping on your produce that you've just harvested, done a really good job of training your workers to harvest correctly, then that's not going to be a good thing. And if the facilities themselves are not in good repair, and if there's potential to create contamination, then that's going to be an issue. Can those facilities be cleaned and sanitized as necessary? Okay, or do they just stand really dirty for a long period of time? And then the last point on there is really important. I've already spoken to, but essentially this whole rule is looking at keeping poop away from food. And so, restrooms and hand washing facilities, are those available to staff and to visitors? Are they adequately stocked? Do they have soap and water to wash their hands? Do they have a way to dry their hands that's sanitary, as in single-use paper towel? Those sort of things. Okay, and then we're going to speak about the compliance dates. And so these are the compliance dates. This is what I said about that water piece. Okay, and so this is based on the different sizes of farms. So if the small business is between 250,000 and 500,000, and those compliance dates for water are only going to be 2023. So you still have 4 years, because it's going to take that long for the FDA to figure that piece out. Okay, for businesses that are bigger than that, they have until 2022, and for very small businesses, they have 5 years from now until 2024 before that kicks in. Okay, but yeah, for most produce, this rule kicked in for the large businesses in January of 2018. For those businesses between 250,000 and 500, it kicked in January of this year, 2019. And then if you're a very small business, it's going to kick in 2020. And I can tell you that as it relates to Virginia, the first inspections for these very large businesses are going to start in May of this year. So VDAX is going to start contacting, scheduling those inspections starting in May of this year. So they are beginning. All right, I'm going to quickly speak to this because I've run out of time, but I'm going to speak to just some of the efforts that Extension here in Virginia are doing. We've trained over 543 people in that Produce Safety Alliance grower training. We've held 19 of those in 15 different cities, and this is constantly being updated because we have these trainings go along. We have 23 agents and specialists that have completed the Train the Trainer program. So we actually participate in training the growers. And then Lindsay mentioned before this on-farm readiness review program. I spend a lot of my time doing these on-farm readiness reviews. I've been to a lot of them in the state of Virginia. Essentially, this is with the actual inspectors who will be doing the regulating. They come out to your farm, and it's essentially like a cheat. Okay, they come out and they sit down with you and they look at your operation. They ask you questions, and they help you get compliant with the rule. Okay, this is an incredible program that I can't stress enough. It is voluntary, it's free, and it's completely confidential. So no notes are taken, nothing like that. No photos are taken. It's completely free. You get given a really great manual, and I can't stress enough. It usually takes about 2 hours. If you haven't done one of these, if you're a covered farm, then you really, really should. People. So a VDAX inspector will come, and an extension person will come, and will leave you with the top 3 areas that you might need to improve, if they even exist. Maybe you're doing everything great. There are no repercussions for this. They're not going to come and find something and say, "Oh, this is terrible." It's really to help you out, and it's very educational. If you want to set up one of these, you can contact VDAX or your state Department of Agriculture, or you can, if you're in Virginia, you can contact me, or you can contact your local extension agent or someone on the webinar today, and we'll be able to help you figure that out. From doing a lot of these on-farm readiness reviews, people are usually a little bit nervous about the produce safety rule, and the feedback that we get is really, really great. And the statement that I like the most is, I feel a lot more confident after doing that, and people do. So if you haven't done this, you need to get signed up for this, and you need to do that before the inspections begin in May, because once the inspections begin in May, if you're a large farm, then VDAX is not going to be able to come back and do these on-farm readiness reviews with you, if they should be inspecting you. And this is the last statement that I may or may not have embellished. But that's my presentation. This is a method of keeping melons off of the ground, which a grower sent to one of our specialists to see if it would work. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Stuart. That's a lot of amazing information in a short bit of time.
Yes, it is a lot of information.
Well done. That was really helpful for me too. I just wanted to quickly mention before Lindsay takes over that we will be providing the PowerPoint slides for people that are interested. So make sure by the end of this session, you can email me and I can send you the PowerPoint slides. So I put my email address in the chat box, and I'll do that again. But I'll remind you again at the end. Take it away, Lindsay.
I like that Stuart used the presenter view. This way you can see my notes as well. Hopefully they'll be to the point. So I'm going to go over what it takes when your customer requires GAP certification. Stuart went into some detail that I can leave out, which is great, because some of it is definitely similar. A lot of it is similar. So yeah, you start by going, oh my God, and then you carry on. You get help as needed by people like us. So the first thing you want to know when the buyer says, I want GAP certification is, oh, actually, I missed the slide, is more information. So does the buyer have a specific food safety standard or audit program that they want you to be audited against? Most common around here, well, in Maryland, they might be satisfied with Maryland GAP, which is a free program you can get through MDA. They might be okay with USDA GAP GIP, which is a relatively simple food safety program. They might want harmonized GAP, which is USDA has a harmonized GAP program. Global GAP has a harmonized GAP program. So that you really need to find out what your buyer requires, because if they don't require anything in particular, then you get to choose, and you can decide just how rigorous a food safety standard you're going to try and comply with. The other thing is, does your buyer have a preferred auditor? So if you're doing a USDA food safety program, then it's usually your state Department of Agriculture that will be auditing you. But if the buyer requires Primus GFS or Canada GAP or Global GAP, you will actually have to find out who are the different certifying bodies or auditors that will come out and audit your farm. So as I said, if the customer just says, I want to see a GAP certificate, then you can decide what that will be. And so there are, as I said, several to choose from. You ask your buyer first, and then if you really don't know what to do and the buyer isn't helpful, you can talk to someone like Stuart, talk to someone like me, or Elizabeth Beggins, who works with Niev and I on this project. Talk to your peers who are food safety certified and find out what their experience is. And then you can do a lot of research online as well. But it really helps to talk to someone who has either educated people about it or is actually doing it, a farmer that's actually doing it. And then the same with which auditor should I hire. You're going to be paying them. If it's not a USDA program where you don't have a choice in who audits you, then you can actually shop around a little bit and find out what people charge. Maybe talk to some peers to find out what kind of experience they have had. Typically, the other certifying bodies can be more expensive than the USDA program, but not always. There's an organization called Quality Fresh that's fairly reasonably priced. I don't know if they're in every state. I do know that they're in Pennsylvania. But some of these others can be quite costly. It really just depends on the size of your farm. For most of you, if you have smaller scale farms, I recommend, if you're in Maryland, starting with Maryland GAP or USDA GAP or USDA Harmonized GAP. So something that you may have heard around about the place is GFSI, which means Global Food Safety Initiative. This is a European NGO that basically does benchmarking of different food safety programs. So if a buyer says to you, I want you to be GFSI certified, that's technically not true. It means that they want you to certify to a program that is GFSI equivalent or GFSI benchmark. Again, I doubt, well, I know Anne and Stacey, you've been dealing with that with Cisco, but for the most part, I think most of you won't really have to deal with this yet. Typically, it's much larger buyers like Cisco or larger food, retail grocery chains that are requiring this kind of thing. And the USDA now has a Harmonized GAP Plus, which is a GFSI government equivalent, it's called. That should be acceptable to buyers that want GFSI benchmarked programs. If this doesn't apply to you, you can not worry about this one too much, but it's getting a little bit granular. Okay, so the timeline for GAP certification, there are a lot of it depends. When people ask me questions, there's so many times I say it depends. The amount of time it takes will depend on how complicated a food safety program you choose or you have to comply with. So that can depend on your customer requirements. It can depend on how complex and large your farm is. The more crops you grow, typically the little longer it takes to get organized and to get audited. Not always the case, but if all you're growing is cabbages and potatoes, it's just going to be a lot easier in general. It depends on your sophistication about food safety. How much education have you had? How much training have you had? And how much availability do you have to get those trainings? And how much capacity do you have to put together a food safety program for your farm? You've got to write the plan, you've got to train workers, you've got to start taking records, keeping records, testing water, and so on. So if you don't have to get audited right away, give yourself some time. I usually say at least 9 months, starting in the winter and planning for an audit later in the season. Gives you time to get your food safety plan written and start implementing it. Getting help from people like us, Co-op Extension, or independent consultants and educators like Elizabeth and I will help to speed things along and also help to make sure that you're really ready for the audit. You don't want to pay for an audit and not pass it. And if there is any kind of cost sharing for the audit, you only get that cost sharing or rebate if you pass the audit. So really ask for help, and again, talk to other farmers who are food safety certified to find out how long did it take them and what did it take for them to do it. This is another, it depends. So what will it cost me? I really like to say the biggest challenges to your brain and your routine. Typically, it's not so much scary as annoying. It's time consuming. There's a lot of details to get it set up. Like any system, it's a lot of getting it set up in the beginning. And then once it's set up and it becomes part of your routine, it's not such a big deal. And for new farmers to be doing this is great, because then it just becomes part of you learning how to farm, as opposed to you've been farming for 30 years and now you have to do this. Very hard to get older farmers to accept that they also have to do food safety. It's usually true that you won't need expensive improvements or upgrades. It may be that you have a terribly, terribly old barn and I have seen this, where it's a really muddy dirt floor and the walls are kind of crumbling. And you actually be better off under a canopy in the field, quite honestly, than in a barn that's a mess and full of bird nests and so on. But you can usually, unless you have to do a very rigorous food safety program audit, you can usually get away with fairly simple operations and equipment, at least in the beginning. And usually as you scale up, you want more efficient equipment. So you want to make sure as you scale up, as you're buying that equipment that makes you more efficient and saves time, that it's also easy to clean and easy to, basically it helps you with your food safety program. The analysis that you have to go through food safety can really help to improve efficiency. And food safety really is a quality issue. So you want to have the best quality product, and a food safety program will help you to have a better quality product to a large extent. And it really helps if you go through these changes step by step. That's why I'm saying give yourself at least 9 months so that you can incorporate changes gradually instead of doing it all at once. We do occasionally, actually my colleague Jeff Stoltzfus, who's Co-op Extension in Pennsylvania, he'll get calls from farmers saying, I have a load of cabbages or a load of something, and I have a buyer who wants it, but he wants me to be GAP certified. Can I get a certificate by Monday? Well, that doesn't happen. You've got to go through all these steps to get there. And then you have to decide if it's just too complicated and it isn't sufficient return on investment. So is this buyer worth going through all this trouble for? And again, someone has to do the work. I do not write food safety plans for people. I write them with people, because you actually have to do the management and the implementation, or you and your team have to do the management and implementation. And I've seen it. I've been to farms where they've been handed a binder with a food safety plan in it that they just put away on a shelf and ignore because they haven't been involved in the development of the food safety program. And that just doesn't work. So you've got to be willing and have the capacity to put in the time to do this. And then the cost of the third-party audit varies dramatically depending on farm size, complexity. You do typically have to pay for travel as well as the time that the auditor is on your farm. Also, there's usually a fee up front just for the processing and final review of your plan. So anywhere from $550 for a small farm, usually no more than $1,000. And for mid-size operations, of course, small and mid-size depends on the state. And in New Jersey, a small farm is 250 acres. In Pennsylvania, a mid-size farm is 60 acres. So it really depends. But $550 is probably the least you would pay, I would think, unless you're doing very, very simple USDA GAP farm review. And as I said, if you're in Maryland, Maryland GAP is free, and it's a good starter food safety program. And then you always want to ask the certifier about cost sharing, or even the buyer. I know that Wegmans is helping people, has been helping people by paying for a certain amount towards their audit. There are a number of different states, unfortunately not Virginia, who have money right now to cover the cost of harmonized GAAP audits. And a lot of them still have cost sharing for the USDA GAAP audits. So you may want, when you, as I said earlier, when you choose the audit that, or the food safety program you decide on, you want to find out if there's any cost sharing to help pay for the audit. So where do you begin? Take it seriously and get trained. That's really what I want to say. And everybody on the farm should become, everyone who's involved in the actual handling of produce on the farm should get some education about food safety and should understand the importance of it. It's really hard if only one person takes all that responsibility and nobody pays any attention for them. You're just setting them up to fail. And the first thing you want to do, and this is true for the produce safety rule as well, is assessing risks. The GAAP certification and the produce safety rule are based on, they're risk-based programs. So there are no hard and fast rules. As Stuart said earlier, there's room for you to actually assess a risk and decide whether or not it's important enough for you to make changes, whether it's serious enough for you to make changes. So you're going to check, you're going to look at what are the potential risks and how great a risk of that hazard occurring. And is there already something in place to reduce that risk? So you may be next door to a feedlot, but you have a hedgerow and a really big green buffer and maybe even some kind of ditch or swale that would prevent any runoff from coming onto your property. So you can assess that risk and decide if there's anything you actually need to do. You decide if there's any way to prevent it. Are there simple solutions? Are there expensive solutions? Do you need to spend a lot of money on it? Do you need to spend any money on it? Do you just need to change where you're planting something or the procedure that you use for planting and harvesting and handling that product? Is it just more training that's needed? And do you need to be monitoring a situation ongoing? And then finally, resources. Who's going to do the work, and do you need to make capital improvements? So this is all part of assessing the biological, physical, and chemical risks on the farm. And I really love this photograph. It comes from, I think they're called Wild Farm Alliance. I've got to remember the name because I love them. They have done a lot of work on how different conservation methods and wildlife habitat restoration and preservation actually helps with food safety, which I think is a really important principle for us to understand. The next thing is get your workers trained. I've listed a bunch of different tools there. Some of them teach you what you need to teach them. Some of them are actually tools to teach workers. Really important, make it easy to do the right thing. Get organized, get everything cleaned up. So many times when I go on a farm, and I do occasionally do internal auditing for farms, if you go onto a farm and it's clean and tidy, you immediately feel more confident that the farmer knows what they're doing about food safety. So it really helps. It helps in your efficiency. I know I'm a chef and working in a kitchen, I can't work in a messy kitchen. I tidy it before I start work. Partly because I'm a neat freak and partly because it makes me more efficient. I don't have to push things out of the way. I don't have a whole lot of clutter to deal with, and I can get on with what I'm doing. So having a really good way to store all of your tools and equipment, now these are actually all photographs that I took on an Amish farm. So you can see that they've come up with systems for keeping harvest bins off the floor and storing knives, and this is a very simple hand washing station. They've got a first aid kit hanging right there. They've got their logs lined up, hanging on clipboards, and they're right next to where they're hanging their label. Simple. This is a hand washing station that they built for themselves. Actually, I don't know that that's Amish. I think somebody else did that. But you can put together a hand washing station very simply, and there's a lot of instructional fact sheets out there for how to do that.
Hey, Lindsay, this is Neve. Just wanted to give you a 5-minute countdown.
Okay, thank you. Test your water. Stuart already talked about that, so I won't go into it. But since there aren't any specific rules from the FDA yet, because they're reviewing that, what I typically recommend is to test well water 1 to 2 times per year and surface water 3 times per year. You want to set up some sort of traceability system. So do you have a lot number system? How are you labeling your packages? Then you want to write a food safety plan. You may need to get some training or some assistance in doing that. Develop standard operating procedures. You can borrow stuff from someone else who already has a food safety plan. Again, there's a lot of stuff out on the web, a lot of templates and so on that you can use. Virginia Tech actually has a lot of wonderful stuff available to you. And if you work with me or Elizabeth, we have templates you can use as well. And I borrow from everybody to make sure that you get what you need. And then implementing the plan, training workers, keeping records, testing your water, starting to label boxes with lot numbers and so on. Then you're going to schedule your audit at the least convenient time of the year, because you want to do it when you're doing as many of the crops that you want to have covered by the audit. You want to have the auditor see the harvesting and packing process that you use for those crops. You want to think about scheduling your audit well ahead of time. There's going to be paperwork to fill out and fees to pay. And I know in Pennsylvania, they usually ask that you give them at least a month, and they get really busy. So I would suggest even more than a month if you can. And then you get your certificate if you pass your audit. And that's the thing that you can show the buyer to show that you have passed a GAP audit. So that's what I was going to say about GAP certification. I've come back to this table, difference between GAP certification and produce safety rule. We're going to send you this PowerPoint so you'll be able to take a look at that table. A question that comes up a lot is, do I have to be GAP certified or FSMA compliant to sell wholesale? This is another one of those it depends answers. Restaurants and smaller stores don't usually require it. Some of you are probably selling to those customers. Certainly if you're doing farmers markets and CSAs, it is not required. Schools, hospitals, and colleges, some of them do, not all of them. However, usually when you're selling to institutions, you tend to be selling through a distributor, and the distributor may require you to be food safety certified. Some of you call those folks wholesalers. I call them distributors because any of these are wholesale customers in my mind. And food hubs like Local Food Hub, I know Anne and Stacey are on here, they don't specifically require food safety certification, but several of their buyers do. And then the FSMA compliance, as Stuart told you, depends on your business sales and size and scope and who you're selling to. It's not something that your buyer can require of you, but they may require it of you. And we're starting to hear about some buyers who are saying, we want you to be FSMA compliant. And the point there is FSMA compliance is easier than GAP certification. So if that's what your buyer requires, that's not a bad thing. And then just really quickly, here are the things that our Mid-Atlantic Food Safety Project are going to be offering. We're already doing one-on-one GAP plan writing and implementation with farmers, and you can contact us if you're interested in that. We will also help you think through what you need to do for FSMA compliance or compliance with the produce safety rule. We're going to have some on-farm workshops, 3 of them this year, 3 of them next year. We're also going to be doing a full day of a 2 full day post-harvest handling, where we're going to go into all kinds of hydro cooling, forced air cooling, different kinds of machinery you can use for post-harvest. So that'll probably happen in November. And yeah, toolkit and templates coming up soon. And I am done.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was really helpful. And I noticed this comment here that somebody mentioned they love the table that you created. So totally agreed. That'll be really helpful for people to have the slides to get a closer look. Thank you for creating that. Well, so thanks to both of our presenters today. Before people hop off, there are two things that I wanted to mention. One is we have recorded today's session, and we have the slides for today's session. So if you would like to be able to look back at those and re-listen to any particular parts of today's conversation, you can either send your email address in the chat box or email me at niamh@futureharvest.com, which I'm going to put into this box here. Before we get to the questions, because I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that folks have, I just wanted to also mention that since we have funding for this food safety grant and to be able to have presenters come share their knowledge with us, we're required to do surveys to get feedback to show that we're actually doing the work that we say that we're doing and that it's valuable. Or if it's valuable, or how we can make it more valuable. So if I'm in this chat box, I'm also going to include the evaluation survey for today's session. So please take the time to fill out that survey. And anyway, so those are the two main points for me. But now I will turn it over to you all for questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away. And if we have time, there are more questions in here that people have written, so feel free to just read from that as well. All right. I guess to start it off, I'll just mention Dina. I don't know if you're still on, but Dina is the executive director with Future Harvest CASA, and she wrote in some information in the chat box that I think is, if you wouldn't mind mentioning it briefly, this is actually a big deal for a lot of our small scale growers. Let me see if she's still on.
Well, I can read it if you like.
Well, I don't mind, since we just had this conversation on our staff call recently. Just as a heads up, so Future Harvest CASA sources food locally for our conference every year, and we take a lot of pride in sourcing from local farms, and a lot of these are farms that haven't been GAP certified and they don't, sell through wholesale. But these conference centers usually haven't been very, so the Marriott was one of the few places that did allow us to source our food from local farms that weren't certified, and they told us this year that they're no longer going to let us source food locally for our conference unless they have a third-party certification. So this is going to change how we are able to source our food for our conference, and we're trying to see if there are other locations that we can still continue that. But as small-scale growers that we've been sourcing from, who maybe this is an issue that we're going to continue to face, and it's just becoming stricter. We only found out about this week, so just wanted to put that on people's radars, essentially.
Thanks, Neve. This is Dina. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. The Marriott was open for many years to source directly from farmers, and that gradually went away. And now they only source from distributors that require third-party certification. So they aren't even bothering sourcing directly anymore. They go to these distributors. So the way it works out for the small-scale farmer is if they can even get GAP certified or a lower-level certification, that's not enough. They have to be third-party certified to sell to these distributors who then sell to the hotel.
Well, Dina, so even Maryland GAP would be considered third-party. The problem is that going through the distributor means that they have to become an approved supplier of that distributor.
Yes,
they can get a third-party audit. Like we used to say, it's like getting a license to hunt. It doesn't mean that you actually get the business.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. But you can ask the Marriott to say, we want you to buy from these farmers for our conference, and if you have enough influence, they will do that. Hopefully you do. But it still means that the farmers are then going to have to get distributor pricing and not direct to hotel pricing. Yeah, sucks.
Yep.
Thanks for bringing that up, Dina. While there are still farmers here on the line, and we have Stuart and Lindsay, if people have further questions or things to ask, please do.
There was a question about vermiculture. I think I decided not to just type in an answer. Hang on a minute. So Safan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked, do these amendments include vermicompost? What types of farm-made compost does this refer to? Stuart, do you want to take that one?
I can. Yeah, the produce safety rule does address that. I don't remember off the top of my head what the preamble in the Code of Federal Register says about vermiculture, but I can get that information and send it along to Neve.
I know that at the recent NECAFS conference, they still didn't have definitive answers about vermicompost. So it's a little bit of a gray area right now. But yeah, this whole thing of biological amendments of animal origin, I mean, that includes bone meal, feather meal, all of these things that people use, that the biggest, like something like worm tea or fish emulsion that people actually spray, do a foliar spray and also a spray on the fruit itself. That's the one that we're still not really clear about, and there's not clear science on whether that's a problem or not. And it could go back to the manufacturer if it's something like fish emulsion, for them to have a guarantee or a letter of assurance saying this product was free of these contaminants when we packaged it and sold it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the burden of proof is on the farmer. So,
right.
Not a clear answer for you, Safan, sorry. But what types of farm-made compost does this refer to? Typically, it refers to farm-made compost that has these, basically raw manure in it.
Yeah.
And
of animal origin.
Of animal origin. If you're not using what's considered a scientifically valid composting process, then you have to treat it like it's raw manure.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and go down the chat box and just go through the questions that were typed in to try and get people's questions answered. Amanda asked, is there any chance of an online FSMA grower training, or is that an unrealistic hope? As far as I know, in Virginia, that is not, we're not offering that. The problem with that is that in order to receive your certificate, you have to be present and engaged in the 8 hours of training. And so I think that's kind of the hurdle of that. I don't know, Lindsay, if you have heard of an online.
PSA is working on one.
Yeah. Right. That's the other thing.
And there is another training that's being vetted right now that may, I'm not sure. It's still in the process. An additional one, so that won't be just PSA grower training that's out there.
And then Neve wrote a question in here. For what kind of sickness should a worker be required not to work? It's essentially something that is going to contaminate produce. I know that's an annoying answer, but if someone turns up and they tell you that they have had vomiting and diarrhea for the last 2 days, then they are likely going to contaminate produce as a result of working with it. If someone, sort of says, my nose is a little runny, okay, that's probably not something to be as concerned about. Again, this is really you're trying to prevent contamination of a foodborne illness as a result of a foodborne pathogen as it relates to the produce safety rule. And so it's up to your discretion. But I mean, I would say anything that, if anyone has had a foodborne illness, they shouldn't be working with produce until, they're cleared by a doctor. I don't know if there's an exhaustive list in the produce safety rule.
Well, I know in GAP it's diarrhea, vomiting, fever, jaundice, something else. There's another one. If somebody has jaundice, I can't imagine. Well, I guess the thing is that it's going to, and also if someone has a really bad cold and they're sneezing all over the place.
Yeah, right.
Not a good idea.
Right.
And if they've had something like hepatitis or, some major illness, that will be another one where you've got to get cleared by the doctor before you're handling food.
Right.
The key here is that particularly if you have migrant or guest workers, they may not want to stop working because they really need the money. So you have to pay attention to how they're looking. And you can, if they're not too sick, you could give them a job that isn't handling produce.
Right. You can reassign them.
Right.
Stacia, sorry if I mispronounced that. She asked, when might the PSA costs go up? I assume you're referring to the PSA training that you have to go to. It's different for each state because different states have different grant funds that allow them to keep those costs down. I don't know off the top of my head. I can find out this information, the date that in Virginia, when that funding is going away. I believe we have it for this year still. The short answer is if you haven't done, if you need to and you haven't done a PSA training, do it as quickly as you possibly can. Because we would hate to have all this funding and it only costs $25 and then all of a sudden it goes up and there's no getting around it. You have to do it. So, so I would do it now is my short answer. Also,
you don't have to do it in the state you're in.
Yeah, it's a national, it's an international certification actually. So you can get it anywhere if it's more convenient. I mean, here in Virginia, people, they go up to Maryland if they're in Northern Virginia rather than driving 4 hours to Southern Virginia to get it.
Stuart, would you be able to share with us, meaning me and Niev and Elizabeth, the list of trainings in Virginia so we can?
Yeah, I definitely will.
Great.
And actually, one of the best things is the Cornell website.
Oh, right.
Because they're the PSA. They have every training, but for the future on there, and so that has nationally. But so I can share both of those. Right. Julia asked, we do field trips. I'm seeking more information on visitor policy. Who is responsible for collecting the data? What data is collected? It's different between GAP and FSMA, Lindsay. So visitor policy for GAP, I'll let you answer that first.
So it depends on the GAP standard that you're certified. It's not a bad idea if you're saying you do 5 field trips a year, to just get everybody's information. You don't have to share it with anyone. The point of getting having a visitor sign-in sheet is if you have some kind of contamination event the day that they're there, it's part of your traceability to be able to say, these are all the people that were on the farm. Maybe someone was sick, maybe, whatever it might be. And then you want to make sure that they're made aware of health and hygiene policies. And there are a lot of signs out there. We have a sign that you can have posted on a wall somewhere or in the bathroom, or you can just make sure everybody reads it. And you can make it part of the education. If it's an educational trip, part of the education is food safety and the fact that you take food safety seriously on your farm. But certainly the information that you collect is not something you need to share with anyone unless there's actually a problem, in which case you may have to share it.
My question is, but who collects that information? Is that fall on the responsibility of the nonprofit conducting the pre-conference activity or the farmer?
Well, It's the farmer. You can ask them to do it for you, but it's your responsibility to collect that information for your own use. So they probably have a list that they can share with you.
All right. Lindsay, you said that. Okay, and so Stacia asked a question about, would this on-farm readiness review be something for smaller farms too, or just covered farms by FSMA? That's a really good question. We do a lot of our on-farm readiness reviews here in Virginia with qualified exempt growers, because the thought being there that, well, if this farm is close to the threshold of being covered, then we want them to be educated. And in reality, we want everyone to be educated. This is a really great program. Here in Virginia, VDAX is very open to offering this free service to anyone who would like it. They have done inspections with completely exempt growers. It's generally aimed more towards, obviously, covered growers and qualified exempt growers. But if you're interested in doing an on-farm readiness review, then chances are VDAX will work with you to try and set one up. If you're only growing $5,000 worth of produce, then there are currently only 4 people in the entire state of Virginia from VDAX who are doing these inspections. So it's challenging and expensive for them to get around to it. But at the end of this month, here in my county, I've set up 2 on-farm readiness reviews, and one of the growers is qualified exempt from the rule. But we, as a point of education, it is definitely open to people who are not necessarily covered. And then going along with that, Elizabeth asked, are you eligible for an on-farm readiness review if you haven't taken the grower training course? Yes, you are. It's recommended that you take the grower training course so you have the knowledge and the understanding, and then you go to the on-farm readiness review. But don't let that disqualify you. If you haven't been able to get to one of those trainings, setting up an on-farm readiness review is still possible.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that was that question about all of that. Oh, here we go. Amanda. Farms with animals and vegetables, are there other recommendations besides having separate footwear for vegetable and animal applications, keeping animals out of vegetable fields, and washing hands between veg and animal chores, or recommendations of places to check for this information?
Those are some good recommendations right there.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm trying to think.
I think one thing to think about is, are the animals uphill from your crops, and do you need to put some kind of barrier between them, which could be a grass buffer, it could be a hedgerow, it could be a berm or a ditch. If you're moving the animals around after you've harvested, you just have to, so if the animals are coming onto the field after you've harvested to clean up, is there enough time between when the animals are on the field and when you're harvesting a crop from that field the next year? And it's good. I was just at a farm last week where he's decided to put his chickens on a patch where he's had produce right after it's finished harvesting, rather than just before he plants. So that way he has the winter really has plenty of time between the animals cleaning, the chickens cleaning up the patch and harvesting in the next season. What else? There are a lot of fact sheets out there for animals and wildlife. Virginia Tech has them, Penn State has them. And the toolkit that we're putting together will be sending out links to all of these things. Stuart, can you think of anything else?
No, I mean, those are all really good best practices. And what I would say as it relates to the produce safety rule, what inspectors are looking for is, are you doing something about it? Okay, so you've recognized, as Lindsay was talking about, it's risk analysis. So you've recognized, okay, I have animals on my farm. There's the potential for the waste that comes from those animals to contaminate my crops. So I'm going to do something about that. And by that, I mean, I'm going to have separate footwear. I'm going to, intentionally keep my domesticated animals out of the fields. I'm going to discourage wildlife from going in there. I'm going to train my employees to wash their hands between doing those things. Those are all really good practices that you're showing that you've identified a risk and you're doing something to mitigate it.
And Elizabeth has suggested also changing clothes or having some kind of coverall that you use when you're working with the animals, and gloves perhaps that you take off and hang somewhere safely before you go and work with vegetables, or vice versa, I guess.
I'm going to very quickly go back to the question about what what illnesses was I referring to earlier, and just go ahead and read it out of what the rule actually states, because that just sort of clears it up. And so the law, the produce safety rule states that you must take measures to prevent contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces with microorganisms of public health significance from any person with an applicable health condition, such as a communicable illness that present a public health risk in the context of normal work duties, such as an infection, an open lesion, vomiting, diarrhea. So kind of all of those things that we spoke about earlier. If you have a communicable disease that can contaminate food, contaminate produce, you want to not let people work if they have that issue.
And if somebody has a wound on their hand, as long as it's covered with a bandage and you're wearing a glove, that's fine. But you can't have open wounds. And you really don't want to have Band-Aids that aren't covered on your hands, because, of course, Band-Aids will get into the food. Yeah. They just always do. Mm. What did the other day, someone was saying, crazy example of kneading bread dough with Band-Aids on their hands.
Yeah, that's right.
That was gruesome.
That was good.
I don't know. Do we miss any questions?
Those are all the questions in the chat box. I don't know if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask any other questions that they've been hanging on to.
Julia, did we really answer your question?
I think so.
Okay, good.
This was a very good webinar. Very well worth my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good. We like that kind of talk. That's good.
We do. I figure 1.5 to 2 hours is generally most people's attention span for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention, Lindsay, the toolkit and where that will live and how people can find those resources?
Right. Well, once we are working on putting together a toolkit with, what do I have? Different kinds of templates for food safety plans, and so I should step back a minute. Hang on, did I lose you guys? Oh, no, there you are. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff out on the web. As I said, Virginia Tech has a whole slew of standard operating procedures and templates and all kinds of stuff. Other organizations do as well. So rather than reinventing and I also have created a lot of that over the years that I've been working with farmers. So instead of reinventing the wheel and creating a whole new thing, what we're going to do is have links to all of these things. You guys will be able to go and take a look at them and see, different formatting, different ways of capturing information work differently. It depends how your brain is. So you can take a look at it and see what makes the most sense for you. We will have also links to videos on machinery and packing shed upgrades. UVM, University of Vermont, has some really great videos. Carolina Farm Stewardship Association has videos. There's all kinds of wonderful stuff out there. And so we're going to be putting together as succinct a toolkit as we can, and it will live on the Future Harvest website, probably also be linked to the Chesapeake Harvest website. And we will just announce it once we get it together. And the nice thing about it is we can keep adding to it as we come across more stuff. So it would be helpful to us if you want to let us know specific things you would like to see in a toolkit, and also these on-farm workshops that we're going to be doing. If you have any specific things that you would like to see demonstrated, or some particular subject matter that you'd like to dive into more deeply, would be really helpful to us to know what that would be.
There was a question that just came up from Roman that said, would a microgreen farm be under the produce safety rule?
Yep.
The answer to that is yes. You know, it's important for you to understand the distinction between microgreens and sprouts, but either way, both of those are produce under the produce safety rule. So they would be, no, it's more complex if you're growing sprouts, but I'll just make it easy and answer your question about microgreens. Yes, if you are growing microgreens, then they are considered produce, and they are under the produce safety rule.
They are typically eaten raw. So
yeah.
All right, look at us.
Yes, well, if there's not a last question, a round of applause for our two presenters today. Thank you, Stuart and Lindsay, very much. Very clear information. And feel free to follow us, Future Harvest and Chesapeake Harvest, on Facebook and Instagram for upcoming food safety workshops and webinars and the toolkit. So I guess this brings us to our close for today's session. Again, feel free to email me with questions and for slides, and please do take the evaluation survey. That would be very helpful. And Stuart and Lindsay, if you have any final thoughts or anything that I missed. Stuart's got his contact information on the chat box. That's great. And that'll be in the slides as well. Great. Well, thank you both, and thanks everybody, and we shall see you next time.
Yes, we will. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to work with you.
You as well.
So, good. Thumbs up. Where did Nia go?
Yeah.
Would you like me to? So I sent the link that I sent that's to all of the PSA trainings in the country, and then I just sent the most recent one coming up in Virginia. Do you want me to send that in an email, or is it okay there in the chat box?
Oh, either both is good, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
That survey that you've created with the web link sounds amazing. I'm really excited to take a look at that.
Yeah, it's a good tool, and people are finding it useful to just have to answer one question at a time. So yeah, VDAX has adopted that onto their website, and some other people have, and it's on some clearinghouses, because it sounded like at the time when I created it that it was, the whole exemption process is, can be very confusing, and it's a need. So yeah, hopefully it's helping some people.
Absolutely. And the language around it is confusing too. Sometimes,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's like when they say that you're covered, sometimes it means the opposite of what the word covered means.
Right, exactly.
That's really challenging.
Yeah. There's a lot of confusing language in food safety, and then along came FSMA with more confusing language, which is different from the existing food safety language, which is crazy. But there you go. One thing I usually say, and I didn't say, was I think everybody should go to a PSA grower training.
Right. Yeah.
Regardless, just so you know, it's good basic gap.
Yeah.
So